Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. Before we dive into today's episode, I'd like to remind you that bookings are currently open for a weekend with Elizabeth Woodville, a 2-day online event beginning on the 19th of July. Explore Elizabeth's life and reign via 6 pre-recorded lectures and 1 live Zoom discussion. I'm immensely proud of the lineup and so excited about the topics being covered. There will be contributions by Susan Higginbotham, Sarah Griswood, Dr. Lacey Boner-Hull, Dr. Kavita Mudan-Finn, Danielle Burton, and Dr. Owen Emerson. Participants will have access to all the content for 2 months and can register from anywhere in the world. For details and to reserve your place, visit my website onthetudortrail.com or just Google A Weekend with Elizabeth Woodville and Eventbrite. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means a lot to me. If you love the podcast and you never miss an episode, please consider joining the Talking Tudors Patreon community. Visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Once you sign up, you'll have access to exclusive posts, additional monthly live talks, a member-only book club, patron-only monthly giveaways, to name just a few of the rewards. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled to welcome Guy Jenkin to the show to talk about his debut novel, Murder Most Foul, a witty and fast-paced Tudor detective novel that weaves fiction around fact. Guy is a multi-BAFTA, RTS and Emmy Award-winning writer, director and producer. His television series include Outnumbered, Kate and Koji, and Drop the Dead Donkey, all co-written with Andy Hamilton. He also wrote and directed a number of TV films, including A Very Open Prison and Crossing the Floor, and 2 feature films, The Sleeping Dictionary and, with Andy Hamilton, What We Did on Our Holiday. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Welcome to Talking Tudors, Guy. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me along. I'm looking forward to it.
Yes, it's lovely to have you on the show. So it would be wonderful if you could just say hello to all our listeners and just tell us a little bit about you and your background.
Well, hello to all the listeners. My name's Guy Jenkin. I'm a writer. I have done nothing else in my life. I write mostly comedy. I started off many years ago on a topical comedy show on BBC Radio, a great place for bringing on young writers, as if you had to just write something about the day's news very, very quickly. And since then, I have written and directed quite a lot of comedy for television, a couple of films, a play. But what brings me here is that I have, for the first time, very, very late, written a novel called Murder Most Foul, which is about Shakespeare and Marlowe's sister, investigating the death of Marlo. So probably what may be most familiar is I've, over the last sort of 15 years, written a sitcom along with Andy Hamilton called Outnumbered, which is about a family life, but which tries to be more realistic. Where the children seem like real children. So.
Wonderful. What a wonderful background. And how wonderful to be immersed in the world of writing your whole life. And so, yes, we're here to talk about Murder Most Foul, which is your novel. Very exciting. And it was released earlier this year. So what was the sort of inspiration behind that? Why did you finally turn to a novel, and why about Shakespeare?
Well, it was partly I had a bit of a medical scare, turned out fine in the end, but it does make you think, what do you really want to do? And I thought, I really want to write a novel. So, in fact, the two things that came out of that, there were two things I decided I really wanted to do. And curiously, they were both set in Tudor times. One is this novel. The other was a film script, which I'm still struggling to get made, about the relationship between Mary Tudor and her fool, Jane Fool. So I think it's probably just a coincidence that both ideas were set in the 16th century, but it certainly helped the research a little bit in that there was quite a lot of crossover. So I think I wrote this as a novel because it just felt like it should be. I've always loved detective fiction, and there is obviously quite a detective element to it, but also I've loved history and particularly this period. So, combining that detection and the historical novel, it just felt it should be, really. So I set out with very little experience to do that. You think of sort of writers like Robert Harris, who have a kind of scaffold of history where the basic facts are true, but then try and just tell a cracking story around that.
Yeah.
That was my object. And of course, it's also very interesting for a writer to write about Shakespeare. Obviously, no comparison. If I did feel that I could write about what it was like to be a bunch of writers, and that kind of world. So I felt I had a little bit of an in there. From what you can tell, that hasn't changed that much. Apart from that, they were better.
So, it sometimes surprises people to know that I actually don't record many episodes on Shakespeare. There's so much dedicated just to William Shakespeare that I tend to stick to other topics. So I'm excited to talk to you about Shakespeare. Do you want to just tell us a little bit? Of course, people are familiar with the name Shakespeare. Many of us, of course, heard about him and his work. But do you want to tell us a little bit about what we know about Shakespeare's personal life and what sort of man he was?
I think it is fantastically hard to know. I mean, there are so many books written about Shakespeare, as you say, but they are based on about a half dozen facts, as far as I can tell. I mean, obviously the writing and the folios have survived, but we really know very little about him. And, writers are very different from what they write. So I think a lot of the books about Shakespeare are supposition. I mean, I think what I find extraordinary is, you'll know this much better than me, but in many ways, the Tudor era seems quite primitive. I'm quite interested in coins. English coins were terrible up to about Henry VI, although they were getting better. I still don't think they had the sophistication of Greek coins in 300 BC. And, I think a lot of Europe saw England as this sort of slightly backward, rainy island. And yet, here is Shakespeare, who, to me, and I think to many people, is the greatest writer in the English language. I mean, and by quite a way. It's not even like there's somebody, to compare him to. And, this was in this society where everything else just doesn't match today. And yet, I mean, particularly with all this AI, we probably will never match that magnificence that he achieved. So for that to happen in so many other ways was a comparatively primitive society, I find fascinating and amazing. And I mean, also the power of theatre then. I mean, I just did a few sums which kind of amazed me. I mean, the Globe, which hadn't been built in 1593 when my book is set, but it had a capacity of 3,400. And if it put on 6 shows a week, that's something like 1 million plus people in that theatre. And then there were sort of 3 other large theatres in London. And yet the population of London was, I think, around 200,000.
Yeah.
Of which, say, 140,000 are adults. So those people must have gone again and again to the theatre, presuming some didn't. But, if there's like 4 million capacity and 140,000 people, it must have had a huge influence on their lives. And you realize why there was a kind of nervousness among those in power about the theatre, was, it could have enormous influence. When the Essex plot, where he
Yes,
got
yeah.
put on Richard II, a weak king being got rid of just before the plot. It shows how it was all sort of woven in.
Absolutely. And I'd love to hear a little bit about Marlowe's death, of course, as well, and the sort of mystery that surrounds it.
Well, I'm sure you know all this, but I found it really interesting to investigate. I certainly, I don't think, unless the time travel is invented, we'll ever know for sure. Yeah. I think looking at the evidence, there is very little doubt that he was murdered and murdered by somebody in power. It started with Kyd, the playwright behind the Spanish tragedy, by at that point the most popular play ever in the theatre, being arrested and investigated for atheism. And he was tortured, never recovered, probably died from that. And if he gave names, then Marlo was the obvious one. He certainly seemed to have a very little sense of self-preservation. There are accounts of him shouting in pubs that Jesus was a magician and that the Holy Ghost raped Mary. And so he was about to be brought before the royal court. And then he is mysteriously murdered in very dubious circumstances in a sort of house come pub in Deptford. 3 men stab him in self-defense when he turns violent. Highly unlikely for a start. And they are Skerries, Fraser and Pooley, all who had worked for Walsingham and Cecil, it seems. I think one of them, Skerries was almost certainly some sort of agent involved in the Babington plot, because he appeared to be one of the conspirators, but was never arrested and then came into a lot of money. So I think either an agent provocateur or a secret agent. And there's also other kind of, if you were a sort of Tudor conspiracy theorist, the murder took place just within 3 miles of Greenwich Palace, which meant that it was a royal coroner who took on the case rather than the local coroner. And Eleanor Bull, who sort of ran the house, had connections to court, I think the cousin or something of the lady in waiting. So, these may be coincidence, but there's a hell of a lot of coincidence. The reason, I think it's very hard to tell, but I think if I had to guess, I would say that most likely somebody was frightened about what he would say. If he was going to be tortured like Kyd, then, whether it was someone who felt vulnerable or whether someone wanted to end that investigation. But,
yeah.
There are a myriad of theories. To me, that seems the most likely.
Yeah, interesting to reflect on them. But as you say, I know it's very difficult to come to any sort of conclusion, but perfect for the novelist, I think, to explore in a novel. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about your own experience of modern day comedy writing and how that compares to comedy writing in the Tudor times.
Well, some things are timeless. There's quite a lot of comedy, including Shakespeare's comedy, that doesn't translate very well into the modern era. But, the slapstick, the men dressing as women and women dressing as men, Some Like It Hot and Cage aux Folles and Mrs. Doubtfire, you see that. And that kind of wicked battle of wits between Benedict and Beatrice, you see in so many things. I think particularly in those sort of 40s comedies like His Girl Friday, but obviously in a number of sort of rom-coms and comedies in the modern day. I hadn't written for the stage for a long time, but recently Andy Hamilton and we had a sitcom set in a newsroom called Drop the Dead Donkey, and we thought it was worth reviving because the way that news has evolved and truth has come into, nobody knows what to believe on the news. So we wrote a stage piece of the newsroom being revived in the modern day and took it on tour. And it was very interesting seeing how the sort of jokes played on different nights to different audiences. And of course, finding some that didn't really work. And, I'd be very curious to know, we have Shakespeare's comedies come down as these set texts.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be curious to know whether the folios were like the starting point or the end point, because I'm sure the same thing must have happened.
Yeah, actually, as you were speaking, I was just thinking of the fact that I have interviewed Shakespeare scholars before. And one thing that I certainly didn't know about Shakespeare plays is that they were revised. They were constantly revised, especially after performances. So I imagine that it's something, similar, where you sort of see how people are responding, and then you might revise, all for a different audience. Of course, if the Queen's going to be in attendance, you might, change certain aspects. So it is, I think that was certainly happening in the 16th century.
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, certainly also, this was what we did was a topical show where we kind of put in new jokes every week. Shakespeare was doing that. I mean, I think in Hamlet, there's a very boring bit about some French swordsman or something who've arrived in town. And it seems to me that refers to something that happened. And it seems to me that's something just sort of put in one night. If productions are wise, they just get rid of that bit. Although, obviously some people feel that you can't touch Shakespeare. Mm. But as you say, I think what you're getting is a version of that play. And it would be very interesting to know what version that folio is.
And so tell us a little bit more about the sort of research and writing journey and what that's been like for you.
Well, I mean, I have to say that my knowledge of the Tudors is probably quite thin. I mean, compared to most of your guests and probably an awful lot of your viewers. Obviously I have an amateur's interest in the period. And as I read everything I could as I sort of set out to write this. But enjoyable though research is, you can't put off the writing for too long.
Yes, exactly.
So I kind of kept it going while I was writing. But I suppose I'm often looking for different things as a writer. Yeah, accuracy is not my highest ideal, but it's kind of very small, fascinating details that often bring things alive. How St. Paul's Cathedral was like a big meeting place for merchants. Stuff was on sale there.
Yeah.
There were gold merchants. Even one account said that small boys used to urinate on the marble floor and then use it like a kind of skating rink. So in this society, which in some way was very religious, and where it was, as we see from Marlo and Kidd, it was very dangerous to question that. But the greatest church was actually a place meeting up, and it was like a sort of coffee shop combined with a fruit market, which I think made me kind of see that London of that period very differently. I was also really interested about how red kites and ravens were encouraged to be there to pick up carrion. Because, I mean, red kites were nearly extinct, but reintroduced about 20 years ago. And now they are flying over London again. It's nice to think that after a several 100-year gap, this is happening. I mean, I haven't seen them sort of swooping on abandoned KFC in where yet, but I'm sure it will happen or has happened. So I suppose, as a writer, as well as trying to create a world that is kind of coherent, but not necessarily the real world of Elizabethan London. You're also looking for things that resonate in the modern world. So things like the hatred of refugees. I think, Danish and Dutch refugees, it was like a political issue because they were Protestant. So the people who tended towards Catholicism were particularly against them. There was one great quote that I actually found after I wrote the book. I would have got it in there, which said how appalling the Danish refugees were because they washed as often as once a week, even in winter, which certainly tells you something about the English. And of course, I mean, that was also, there was also an element in Marlowe's murder where one of the anti-refugee pamphleteers went under the sobriquet Tamburlaine, and almost certainly wasn't him, given how appalling the verse was. I don't think Marlowe would have ever written anything that bad. And probably just picked a popular name from the theatre. But that may also have contributed to his arrest because, you know, he was associated with a dissident who was pinning up these notices on church doors. And, you know, I was sort of fascinated how the plague, you know, there were a lot of similarities with the pandemic. You know, just a sort of the worst plague in 20 years or something was, and they say, 13% of London's population died? It seemed to be they just kind of accepted that. But the fact that there were constables going around with sticks that marked how close people were allowed to get to each other, that kind of version of social distancing.
Exactly.
And, you know, people who weren't allowed to leave their houses with the red crosses on the door, and where the penalty was to be buried alive in a plague pit with bodies. I don't know. I've not heard of any instance of that being carried out. But yes, so I think I was looking a lot for those things that resonated with me.
And I agree with you that those moments like the ones you mentioned about St. Paul's Cathedral are very powerful because that, you know, that's the emotional connection that we can form with these people when we have those little details. So interesting. If people read your book, what's something you'd like your readers to take away from it?
I'd like them to enjoy it. You know, I've written something that I hope sort of works as a good page-turning detective story. But I'd also like, you know, it to perhaps rekindle an interest in that era in the way that, you know, my research rekindled it in me. And yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people seem to have come away saying, I didn't know how filthy London was. I think perhaps I've more than I realized. I had created a picture of this smelly, filthy world. I mean, it is interesting with people who've read it. I think one of the things that they talk about and come away with are some of those little details about London and Tudor England. I think people are fascinated in, you know, as you say, there's like the St. Paul's Cathedral thing, that, you know, just things that humanize
exactly, yeah,
that era. And as I say, it's those tiny details. You suddenly think, yes, that brings it alive, or, you know, now I understand it better.
Yeah, it's very true. I think certainly traveling back in time to Tudor London would have been an assault on our senses completely. I think it would be quite an interesting experience. So, Guy, before I let you go, there's something I do at the end of episodes when I first have guests on the show, and that's what I call 10 to go. So they're just 10 quick questions just to get to know you a little bit better. And the first one is, because we're all bibliophiles on Talking Tudors, what is the last book that you read, or perhaps something that you're currently reading at the moment?
Oh, I've just finished a book called Fundamentally by Nusiba Yunis. It's a novel where someone who's an academic, a criminologist, is recruited by the UN to go to Iraq and work on the de-radicalization program. And it's a great book.
I've read it as well, and I have to say it's different to what I normally read, but I really enjoyed it. I just kept reading until I finished it. It was quite compelling and funny, as you say, which is amazing given the seriousness of the sort of subject, I guess. But yeah, wonderful book. I agree with you.
I think it also shows the power of novels sometimes, in that I've read a few books about post-war Iraq, but I just thought it kind of brought it alive to me. I mean, obviously she did it herself and it knows it fantastically well, but I found that, you know, I came away with a picture of that world that was far more vivid than, you know, I've read good books about it, you know, Green Zone, I think, and a couple of others.
Yeah, absolutely. Put it on your TBR list if you haven't read it. And what about any writing rituals? Do you have any that you follow when you're in writing mode?
Well, recently I tend to write in a cafe. I walk my dog in the morning. We end up in a local cafe. I put on headphones and listen to the music I'm sort of familiar with, which then kind of blanks out the world around me. She settles down under the table and I drink a lot of coffee and write. But I mean, I find that, I suppose partly there's kind of no distractions.
Yes, yeah.
Like you can't go and eat away. I suppose you could go online, but I don't there. And so that was kind of strangely, although being in a kind of public place, I actually do concentrate much better than being at where I can sort of wander off and do things.
Yeah, a lot of people say that. I know I haven't really tried writing so much in a cafe. I do other sort of more admin work, but I'd love to be able to do that because I think it's a inspiring sort of place because you've got people coming and going, and I like the headphones idea. I think that's perfect. And what about an ideal Sunday morning? What does that look like for you?
Oh, well, my weekends are often very football based. Going to, sort of play or coach or go and watch Crystal Palace if they play at home. So Sunday mornings, I don't know, go for a walk, have a coffee with my children, who are grown up now, but around. And then sort of, if it's summer, do a bit of gardening.
Nice.
Sounds very dull, doesn't it?
No, it sounds perfect. It just sounds really peaceful and lovely.
Watch some sport on TV in the afternoon. It's
perfect Sunday. That's it. I love it. And what about a new skill that you might like to learn? Is there something that's sort of on your bucket list?
Well, I mean, they say you should try new things. I suppose, novel writing was, in a way, something new to me. I mean, you come to it with, I think I bring to it the ability to write character and dialogue and plot.
Mm-hmm.
But just putting it down in words, in the right words, in the right order, it's very, very difficult. I do feel I'm still learning.
And so if there are days where you're feeling a little bit uninspired, what do you sort of do to get back into that creative, inspired mode, I suppose?
I think you don't know when you're going to have a good day or a bad day. You're just going to sit down and write. The odd day when you probably just might as well throw it all away at the end. They're rare, I think. As long as you're writing, you may suddenly hit a great spot. You may suddenly sort of take off on a scene or something. But just doing it.
It is true. Turning up and doing it is a big part of it, isn't it? And what about I don't know if you do a lot of travel or if you have traveled before, but is there a destination you might like to visit that you haven't seen yet?
Oh, many. Yes. I mean, I traveled a lot before sort of children and dogs, but I always wanted to go to Mongolia. Fascinating. I'd like to travel more to South America, but I could sit here for 10 minutes and just
telling me. Oh, you've got a lot of places you want to visit. That's fantastic. And so what about a film that you've watched more than once? Is there a film that you sort of go back to, whether that be for comfort or just entertainment or laughs?
Well, do you know that one? I think I might have mentioned it earlier when I was talking about Shakespeare, but I do love some of those 40s films and like his Girl Friday. The scripts must be about 4 times as long as modern films. They just rattle through the line.
Love it. And so I know you said you've pretty much been writing your whole life, but when you were a child, is that what you hoped to be when you grew up? Did you want to be a writer or did you have moments where you wanted to be something else?
Well, I think I wanted to be an astronaut early on.
Fabulous.
Most children of that generation. I think if I hadn't been a writer, I would like to have done something, maybe sort of entomology or something, traveling to distant places and looking at strange insects.
Yeah, it sounds like fun. I like it. And last question, what do you like to do then to just relax and unwind and switch off from writing and everything else?
Well, I think football. I think it's. I stopped thinking for a bit. I think very therapeutic. It is something where you sort of have to live in the moment because you can't analyze anything and
no.
you just so sport. I think.
Yeah, that's true, isn't it? And I think that's probably true of lots of things where you're doing something physical. The mind, thankfully, gets sort of shut down for a little bit, which is always a relief. There is one final thing, and that is the Tudor takeaway. So I do ask my guests for a takeaway. So this is something for our listeners to perhaps go off and explore after the episode. So do you have a takeaway for us?
This relates more to the film than the book, but I found that the fools and jesters were a very interesting way into that era. There seemed to be that very fine line about what you can say and what goes too far.
Oh, yeah.
And there seemed almost to have been sort of rap battles where people were rude to each other in verse and so on. But the book that I read on it that was good was Fools and Jesters in the English Court by John Southworth.
Thank you. I will add a link to that for our listeners. And thank you so much, Guy, for taking the time to talk Tudors with me. It's been lovely to meet you.
No, it's been very enjoyable. Thank you very much.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining me. If you've enjoyed the show, please spread the word on your socials. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join the Talking Tudors Patreon community for some fun, exclusive content, and the Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Instagram. My handle is themosthappy78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.